Good morning, everybody. I hope you're well on this Monday morning. This week, the poems that I'm going to read for you are going to be mostly centered around my son, Cam, and the experience I've had with him so far. Everything from sort of his birth to questions he asked me and things that probably fall somewhere in between. So I think most of the poems this week, all of the poems this week, are going to be about that. It's interesting because there's a lot of conversation in the literary community about, the role, I suppose, that children can or should or shouldn't play in your writing and how they can serve as points of inspiration, I suppose, or how they can inhibit, and how parenting is complicated if you're a writer of any kind. And then there's also specifically the issue of mothering and how that relates to poetry. And there's that whole terrible sort of categorization that I hate, that's, this idea of mommy poems, which I find condescending at best. And I think that people are still fighting sort of to get that point of view out there. A lot of the poems that I'm going to read this week are poems that I think are strong poems, and yet they're the ones I've had the hardest time finding homes for. A lot of them are not published yet. This is not to say I haven't gotten a response about them. A lot of them have received a lot of positive response from places I've sent them, but nobody's willing to, I guess, take the final step with them, which I think is kind of interesting, which usually just means that you have to kind of keep persisting, and then eventually they'll hit. But I think it's fascinating because that's not something I've experienced with other things I've sent out. On the flip side of that coin, the first sort of piece of nonfiction that I ever wrote was about my son and the experience I had when he was first born. And I wrote it sort of in a fever at 6:30 in the morning when he was probably about, I don't know, 3, I guess, 2 or 3. And that is probably the most well received piece of writing I've ever written. So it's a fascinating, parenting and poetry is a fascinating sort of idea. And parenting in this particular circumstance right now, with everything going on with COVID-19, is also kind of fascinating. I've seen a lot of things floating around social networking about this idea, and I'm sure I'll probably have a lot to say about it this week. I've already talked more in this little intro than I probably have in other intros. So obviously this is something that's important to me. Suffice to say that I do not find that my child inhibits my writing intellectually, mentally, inspirationally speaking, I suppose. I mean, obviously time is less. But I think I had mentioned that poem Fledgling that I read a week or so ago, I suppose, was the first thing that I wrote after he was born. But I've written fairly consistently. I mean, as consistently as I always did, I think. And I do find him a fascinating lens to sort of look through. And that doesn't mean I don't look through other lenses. But he experiences the world in a way that I do not. And so I think that's really interesting. So the poem that I have for you today is sort of inspired by him. And it's about it's from a series of poems that I've been working on around the fairy tale of the Snow Queen by Hans Christian Andersen. And I don't know if people are familiar with this story. You can Google it, but my kid is obsessed with it, and we have a fairly long version of it that I have read to him probably no less than 50 times. And it's a really interesting story because it's got kind of 2 or 3 parallel stories running at the same time. And the imagery is really interesting, and it centers around a boy and a girl, 2 children. And so this poem is called Copper Coins, and it is one in a series of poems that I'm writing around that fairy tale. that Cam loves so much. So this is called Copper Coins. I dream of a girl with copper coins covering her eyes. She flies over hard-packed snow in a sleigh, pulled not by horses, but swirls of snowflakes that take the shape of hoof or nostril or velvet ear. She is gray-blue cold. She is the voice you hear beneath the wind when it settles in the tops of firs to rest. She is frost. She is relentless. She is lost. She is alone. She is a story. She is a wish. She is a pair of shoes. She is an orphan. She is a captive. She is brave. She is a boat. She is roses, lilies, violets I grow in my garden. She is the daughter I will never wake to find, running through my cherry orchards in summer, fruit staining her mouth dark red. So that's my poem, Copper Coins. And like I said, I've got a whole series of poems around the Snow Queen, some of which I might read some more of next week. But again, just another sort of, I guess, example of something that has become very apparent to me in the time that I've been a mother, which is that your child's obsessions typically become yours, for better or worse. And this takes the form of all sorts of things in my life, the Snow Queen being one of them. Other things, like Street Fighter, Lord help me, or Mortal Kombat, or things like that. I don't know if I'll be writing poems about Mortal Kombat. Maybe I will. But it's something that I think is really interesting because, and maybe this is something to sort of leave this little video on, but I think there's always the fear that perhaps your life becomes smaller when you have a child. And I'm not going to say that that's not true in some instances. I wrote a whole essay about the idea that you can feel a bit claustrophobic in that role. However, I will say this. I think it also expands your world if you let it. And I think it can expand it in ways that you had never even considered. And I think that can only be good for writing. I don't think it can be bad. So I hope you're all having a lovely Monday, and I'll speak to you soon.